Selanjutnya kita akan menuju ke pembicara yang terakhir ya. Beliau hadir di Zoom. Our final presentation from this morning will be delivered by Dr. Nurul Ain, whose research brings refreshing methodological depth to our understanding of Islamic thought. Ibu Dr. Nurul, the floor is yours. Silahkan Ibu.
Terima
40
kasih, Bu
menit.
Neng. Terima kasih juga saya ucapkan kepada asosiasi Akidah dan Filsafat Islam Indonesia di atas jemputan. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Distinguished professors, esteemed scholars, colleagues, and honored guests. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It is a privilege to stand before this assembly of thinkers who carry the intellectual trust of our civilization. And today I speak not merely about philosophy as an academic discipline, but about the identity of knowledge itself and the urgent question of who we become when our intellectual foundations are forgotten, borrowed, or fragmented. And before we can reconstruct anything, we must first understand the intellectual climate of the age we live in. And every civilization is shaped not only by its institutions, but by the atmosphere of ideas that surrounds it. And our age is shaped by a chain of worldviews, modernity, and followed by postmodernism, and each reacting to the one before it. Modernity separated the sacred from the secular, being from meaning, the mind from the soul. And in doing so, it intentionally created a vacuum, a crisis of purpose. And from this vacuum emerged nihilism, the sense that nothing carries inherent meaning anymore. And postmodernism then rose as a response, claiming to stand against the emptiness. It promised liberation from rigid truth by declaring that every truth is relative. Every narrative is constructed and meaning is personal. But instead of healing the crisis, postmodernism deepened it. In trying to solve nihilism, it ended up supporting it from the other side by dissolving the very possibility of stable truth, stable identity, and stable meaning. And the impact had been more severe on the youth. Confusion, fragmentation, emotional exhaustion, and the silent collapse of spiritual confidence. And we will speak about this in the coming discussion. And so, with this background, let me begin with the first reality we must face. That is the crisis of meaning in the modern world. Nihilism is a word that describes our age. Nihilism is not simply atheism or doubt. It is a condition in which the world loses its inherent meaning. Truth dissolves into opinion. Purpose gives way to utility. Morality becomes negotiable, and human beings become measurable units of productivity. And this crisis did not emerge overnight. It is the outcome of a worldview, one that separated the sacred from the secular, and being from meaning, the mind from the soul. And here is the first important point. Modernity was not created with malicious intent. So Western thinkers did not wake up one day and say, let us colonize the entire intellectual world. And rather, they constructed a worldview based on their own historical anxieties, theological struggles, and philosophical decisions. But the tragedy is this, that their worldview later become universalized through colonial structures, through educational institutions, and global academic rooms. And not out of, we call it malice, but out of certainty. And this certainty, when unexamined, becomes a form of power. Unexamined certainty is when a worldview becomes universal, not because it is correct, but because it has never been challenged. And this is a point that deserves our deepest reflection. For a worldview built on unexamined certainty can quietly shape entire societies, not through force, but through assumptions so normal that they become invisible. And what becomes invisible becomes the most difficult to challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, if nihilism explains the condition of our age, then the next step is to understand the intellectual structure that shaped our perception of ourselves. A crisis of meaning is not only spiritual, it is also epistemic, and it alters how we class knowledge, how we organize the truth, and how we decide what counts as philosophy. And this is why it becomes absolutely essential to examine the classification systems of Western knowledge, not because we wish to accuse or condemn, but because every civilization reads the world through the categories, and it creates, and when those categories become global, they shape how everyone else reacts and reads themselves. And too often we point fingers outwards towards colonialism, the West, Orientalism, without actually realizing that our greatest vulnerability lies not in what others imposed, but in what we absorb without noticing. And this is our fragility, not oppression, but uncritical acceptance. And this leads to a crucial question. How did Islamic thought become redefined, reorganized, and repackaged through frameworks that were not our own? And here we come to the role of Orientalist classification. Western scholars here were not trying to destroy Islam, they were trying to define it in the only terms that they understood. And this is how they made Islamic civilization, you call it legible, that is readable, simplifiable, and sortable within the boundaries of their own intellectual universe. And in theories of legibility, whether, in James Scott's political anthropology, or Edward Said's critic of Orientalism, or Talal Asad's anthropology of religion, legibility means reducing a complex reality into categories that make sense to the observer and not necessarily to the observed. And that is actually what happened with Islamic philosophy. And the tragedy is this: over time, we begin to see ourselves through those same simplified categories, not because they were correct, but because they were repeated in our textbooks, our university, our curricula, and our intellectual habits. And the borrowed lenses becomes so normal that we no longer recognize that they were borrowed. All right, so let's see how the classification systems are and how they shape actually Islamic philosophy. Now, what do we mean by Oriental classification systems? And Orientalism created intellectual categories that still define how Islamic philosophy is studied today. As we see here, Islamic philosophy is seen by them as Greek philosophy in Arabic, or falsafa actually ended with Ibn Rushd, and nothing meaningful happened after that. And they say that Sufism or mysticism is irrational, emotional, unphilosophical. And they say Kalam is anti-philosophical or merely polemical. And Islamic thinkers were transmitters, not originators. And these classifications were not created as an attack on Islam, but as attempts to make Islamic civilization legible, as I said, within the frameworks of European intellectual history. But the effects were profound. We began to see ourselves through borrowed lenses. And this leads us naturally to the third dimensions of our discussion, ladies and gentlemen. And earlier we highlighted that modernity's unexamined certainty shaped how others defined our intellectual tradition. And now we want to deepen our understanding of how these definitions operate from within and through the assumptions that form the very foundation of Western epistemology. And assumptions are not harmless ideas. Epistemologically, assumptions actually determine what counts as truth, what makes methods as are valid, and what questions are worth asking, and which forms of knowledge are considered rational. And in other words, assumptions are the silent architecture of knowledge, and they form the lens through which reality becomes visible or invisible. So when a civilization's assumptions become global, its epistemology becomes global, and this is precisely what happened to us. Western philosophical assumptions did not simply describe knowledge, they restructured it. And they shaped our curricula, our research framework, our academic benchmarks, and even how we judge ourselves, our own intellectual heritage. And yes, we were colonized today, in history, but when we realize we have been intellectually colonized and still allow those assumptions to govern our thinking, then it's no longer colonization. It becomes consent. And consent to one's own intellectual diminishment is the most dangerous form of defeat because it is voluntary, silent, and invisible. And I don't want to actually explain what the assumptions are, but we see that, some of the Western academic assumptions include like philosophy must be secular, it must be, knowledge must be value neutral, and then metaphysics is outdated and so on. So these assumptions actually shape university curriculum, research priorities, and peer review criteria, these kind of things. And all of these were exported into the Muslim world through colonial education systems, and thus, even after political independence, we remained intellectually colonized. And the intensity of this colonization lies in the fact that it did not conquer our lands alone. It conquered our categories, it conquered our language of thought, and the very grammar of how we understand reality. And now we must open our eyes not only to the structure that shaped our past, but to the generation living beside us, the generation that will inherit the future of the Muslim intellectual world. And the symptoms of intellectual colonization are no longer subtle. They are severe. And while some among us are searching for a cure, many are quietly drowning beneath the weight of a worldview that was never theirs to begin with. And too often, we look only at the surface symptoms, confusion, apathy, doubt, fragmentation. but symptoms or signs of a deeper disease, one that has been growing silently within our educational system, our universities, and even our ways of thinking. And we grieve the visible tragedies of the world, you know, the wars, the destruction, the bloodshed, but we rarely acknowledge is the invisible tragedy that's the quiet killing of the minds, the erosion of meaning, and the shrinking of the Muslim intellectual soul. It is here that we must confront the real impact of these epistemic structures on Muslim education and life. And some of the, I would say, some of the impact on Muslim education and life is this produced for long-term effect is one of the fragmentation of knowledge. You know, you see falsafa, kalam, and tasawwuf separated, and then science divorced from metaphysics, education divorced from ethics, university divorced from wisdom. And the second is the loss of intellectual confidence, where Muslims begin to doubt the philosophical value of their own tradition, and we become consumers, not producers of knowledge. And we see that there is a redefinition of success, and success became, you know, rankings, KPIs, productivity, citations, and also the reshaping of the Muslim mind, where we see the structure of thinking itself change, and we inherit modernity's categories without questioning to their metaphysical origins. And what more are we waiting for as scholars? Shall we remain silent until this intellectual illness metastasizes, you know, beyond a cure, like a cancer that actually spreads because no one dared to diagnose early? So a question must now be asked: and do we actually need a new philosophy for the modern age? And my answer is clear: we do not need a new philosophy. We need to reactivate the one we already have. And Islamic metaphysics does not need reinvention. It needs you call it resurrection. And because its principles are timeless, the unity of reality, the purposefulness of creation, the hierarchy of being, the dual nature of human as abd and khalifa, and knowledge as illumination, not mere information. And these principles once shaped the brilliance of our civilization, not because Muslims possess advanced tools, but because they possess a unified metaphysical architecture that ordered science, ethics, and governance and spirituality and education into one coherent whole. And in contrast, the metaphysical decisions that shaped modern Western thought moved in a different direction, as we see dualism, secularization, and you see a mechanistic universe, and the autonomous of the self and the truth reduced to what can be measured. And from these decisions, modernity emerged. As we see, from modernity came colonial structures, and from colonial structures came global academic norms. And so the colonization of land ended, but the colonization of worldview continued, not because their metaphysics were superior, but because ours was forgotten. And we come here having understood that the roots of fragmentation and the metaphysic structure that shape modern Muslims' consciousness. We now stand at the most important part of the discussion, that is the diagnosis alone is not enough. A civilization does not heal by merely describing its wounds. It heals by constructing a map for recovery. And as I see here, it heals through intellectual architecture. All right, as I see it, I have created something called the decolonization roadmap. And here is a diagram presents that's the roadmap, a strategic process for actually reclaiming Islamic intellectual identity. So it moves from three essential stages, as you see. First is diagnosis, where we identify the inherited frames, the Orientalist classifications, for instance, the secular epistemic priorities, and actually those colonial assumptions that still shape how Islamic philosophy is thought and evaluated. And thus, without diagnosis, any reform remains superficial. And the second is deconstruction, where we integrate the borrowed worldview, its dualism, its materialism, its separation of ethics from knowledge. And this is not unconsciously actually about rejection, but about revealing the metaphysical assumptions we unconsciously absorb. And the third is reconstruction, where we rebuild our philosophical and educational frameworks upon Tawhidic principles. We integrated ontology, revealed epistemology, prophetic anthropology, and so on, and the returns of education to its civilizational purpose. And this is what I created, something by the name of TMIM, which is the Tawhidic Metaphysical Integrative Model. And this model is the Tawhidic Metaphysical, as I said, TMIM, which offers not merely a conceptual map, but a practical civilizational framework. And you see here, each quadrant points not to definition, but to actions we can take today. And as you see from the first quadrant here, the ontological quadrant is the implementation. That means reorganizing our curricula so that knowledge is no longer fragmented into isolated disciplines. And it's almost done at the end. All right. So I think we should just here together, both of these diagrams offer both the architecture and the pathway, a unified metaphysical map, and the method to actually reclaim it what should I say here? And let me end with this. We do not seek to return to the past. We seek to return to the principles that made the past luminous. And may Allah grant us clarity, courage, and hikmah to revive a philosophy worthy of our civilization and meaningful for humanity future. Wabillahi tawfiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ya, beri aplaus untuk Ibu Dr. Nurul Ain Norman. Hadirin sekalian, presentasi ini menghadirkan diagnosis yang tajam ya mengenai krisis intelektual yang dialami dunia Islam hari ini. Dr. Nurul Ain menunjukkan bagaimana modernisme ini melalui sekularisme tadi, fragmentasi pengetahuan dan kategori epistemik yang dipaksakan tidak hanya merusak struktur keilmuan kita, tapi juga menyusutkan imajinasi dan kepercayaan diri intelektual umat. Dengan tadi membongkar cara orientalisme membentuk asumsi akademik kita, ia mengingatkan bahwa kolonialisme yang paling berbahaya bukanlah yang merampas tanah, tetapi yang menduduki kerangka berpikir. Ya, kemudian tadi Ibu Dr. Nurul Ain juga menegaskan bahwa kita tidak memerlukan filsafat Islam baru, melainkan perlu mengaktifkan kembali metafisika, etika, kosmologi Islam yang komprehensif. Reactivation of our existing metaphysical and intellectual heritage. Ya, menjadi seruan yang sangat relevan dengan tadi yang pertama diagnose, kemudian setelah itu deconstruct, ya ini kemudian direkonstruksi, a pathway to intellectual emancipation. Kemudian Ibu Dr. Nurul Ain juga tadi menawarkan model PMIM, Civilizational Compass, yang mengintegrasikan tadi ontologi, epistemologi, antropologi, dan aksiologi yang berbasis tauhid, memberikan arah konstruktif bagi dekolonialisasi intelektual. Hadirin sekalian, presentasi ini mengajak kita tidak sekedar mengkritik, tetapi membangun kembali arsitektur pikiran yang mampu mengembalikan kedalaman makna dan tujuan dalam pendidikan serta tradisi ilmiah Muslim. Baik, demikianlah 3 presenter yang luar biasa. Kita beri applause lagi untuk ketiganya. Ya, selanjutnya kita akan memasuki sesi. Oh, Sholat Jumat ya. Oke, jadi bagaimana? Cukup. Oke, rupanya karena ini Jumat, saya lupa sekali ya kalau hari Jumat karena saking menikmatinya, Prof. Ya Allah. Ibu Nurul Ain luar biasa ya, tajam, kuat sekali, bahkan punya model dari Prof. Mulyadi Kartanegara juga begitu konstruk ya, mengkonstruk dari dalam gitu, dan Pak Budi juga apa, bagaimana tradisi Islam ini menjawab tantangan-tantangan kontemporer dengan ekoteologinya, Pak. Pokoknya ini harus terus kita pentingin semua, teman-teman. Baik, ini di penghujung karena ini hari Jumat dan para delegasi dan teman-teman ya. Ya, tapi tadi ini dari Ibu Ketua Pelaksana, kita foto dulu katanya ya. Tapi untuk itu saya, oh ada penyerahan cenderamata dulu. Sebelum foto, ada penyerahan cenderamata untuk kedua narasumber. Saya persilakan kepada Ketua ASAFI ya, Profesor Dr. Haji Khalid Al-Walid MAG untuk menyerahkan. Sebagai moderator, saya akhiri saja dulu sesi apa seminar ya, konferensi internasional pada sesi pagi ini. Mohon maaf apabila banyak kesalahan. Wallahu yarhamuna birrahmati tamah. Wallahul muwafiq ila aqwamit thoriq. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi